The year is 1959. Writer René Goscinny and artist Albert Uderzo are sitting at Uderzo's home. They've been drinking traditional French alcohol called pastis for these long afternoons, throwing ideas for a new comic book character. While trying to come up with something useful, they can feel the deadline closing in fast. A brand new French comic magazine called Pilote will launch just in a few months. And they have the task of creating something that will sell it. It should be something with a historic theme. A little earlier they thought that they had the solution in a classic folk story, Le Roman de Renard, with its anthropomorphic animals. But they decided to scrap the idea when they heard that such an adaptation had already been done. At some point Goscinny presented Uderzo a question. What was the point in history when France became something that could be really called French? First, Uderzo suggested prehistoric times, but after a bit more serious thought, he considered that maybe it happened under the Gauls. This stopped Goscinny in his tracks. As he considered what Uderzo had just said, he knew they had found their answer. And within 15 minutes, they had the first complete Asterix story figured out. Little did they know that they had just created a monumental success story. Not only would they break every sales record, but they would also kickstart an evolution that would change the face of Franco-Belgian comics forever. This change would be a crucial step in transforming Bande Dessinée in one of the most important institutions in comics. Hello and welcome back to Analog Comics. This video essay could be seen as a direct continuation to my video about the beginnings of Franco-Belgian comics. But you don't have to watch that video in order to understand this one. I ended that video by briefly mentioning Pilote Comics magazine. Pilote was revolutionary in many ways, and I strongly believe that without it, the whole French comic scene would be quite different today. When talking about Pilote magazine and its importance for the future of French comics, I cannot avoid mentioning René Goscinny. He wasn't just one of the founders of Pilote. His editorial skills were paramount to the success of that magazine. His work not only made the comics more widely accepted, but it also brought respect to the craft itself. Before Goscinny, comics writers were seen as expendable and inconvenient expense within comics. He helped to change that by becoming as famous and appreciated as the illustrators he worked with. That was a very rare thing during his time. And then there was Asterix, a comic book about a Gallic village that, with the help of magic potion that gave them superhuman strength, refused to surrender to the conquering Roman armies. All stories were built on witty humor, well-meaning stereotypes, funny running gags, slapstick, puns, and tons of cultural and historical references. It made fun equally of everybody and everything, but most of all it made fun of French people who were always seen eating or arguing among themselves, but always united if threatened. French people loved it, and soon Asterix was seen as the symbol of the country. These three names, Pilote, Goscinny, and Asterix, they are the glue of this video, holding it together. I'll take a look at each of these names and how they intertwine into a pivotal moment in a French comic book history. Let's start with Asterix. Despite its monumental global success, there isn't much YouTube content about it in English. I'd guesstimate that the reason for that is found from USA. USA is, well, quite naturally the main source for comic book content in English. And Asterix never really had the kind of success there that it had elsewhere. And as this video is not so much about the content of Asterix, but rather its effects on Bande Dessinée, let me introduce you this magnificent comic book series through numbers. Asterix is one of the biggest success stories to ever come out of Franco-Belgian comic book market. In fact, if we are only to look at the sales numbers, it is the most successful comic book ever from Europe. It also holds the second place for the best-selling collected comic book for the whole world, with approximately 400 million albums sold. Now, let that sink in. 400 million sold copies, leaving behind such classics like Tintin and Lucky Luke. The first place in sales figures belongs to a manga called One Piece. But what makes Asterix stand out in those sales figures is the small number of published albums. First album version of Asterix was published in 1961, 63 years ago. The last album to come out before making this video was Asterix and the White Iris. That is the album number 40. So it's 63 years, only 40 albums published, 400 million sold units. Asterix has not only been translated into over 100 languages, but in many places it has also been translated to local dialects. Even here in Finland we have certain volumes available in 4 different dialects, on top of the official Finnish version. Asterix has spawned also movies, cartoon and live action, and numerous video games. There is even Asterix amusement park near Paris, next to Disneyland. Just by looking at this data, you don't need to know about the content of Asterix. Regardless if you like it or not, regardless if you have read it or not, or even heard about it, it's obvious how important part of Bande Dessinée Asterix is. But what is less obvious is how important it was for the future of French comics that Asterix was published in Pilote magazine. And to understand why Pilote magazine was so important, you have to look at the competition it entered. The term Franco-Belgian comics, often also referred to as Bande Dessinée or BD for short, refers to its countries of origin, France and Belgium. It's a common misconception that the rise of French language comics started from France, but it actually started from Belgium. Most people outside the hobby of comics would say with confidence that Tintin and Lucky Luke are from France, but originally they are Belgian comics. Same kind of confusion would likely happen with Spirou, Blake and Mortimer, the Smurfs, Largo Winch, Thorkel. These are all Belgian comics. It is also understandable that this type of detail would feel insignificant for many people. But getting a competitive, high-quality hero from France was not only important to French comic book readers, but to whole France. French people love Asterix. It is the embodiment of Frenchness in comics, and often outside it too. I mean, they named their first satellite Asterix 1. Asterix has been used as marketing and PR tool for France in many occasions. Before Pilote, the French language comic scene, also referred to as Francophone comics, it was in the hands of 2 Belgian magazines, Spirou and Tintin. I have often called them as the Big Two of Belgium. The way the comic magazines worked back then is that they gave the readers each week just a page or 2 of any series, and the next week you got a little bit more, so it could take months before you got to the end of the story. And as it happens, before Pilote, René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo, they were also working for the Tintin magazine. There they even had their first co-created hit called Umbach. And it already had a lot of the ingredients that made Asterix successful later. Goscinny's writing is infused with wit and sharp-eyed, yet well-meaning lampooning. Uderzo's art is very dynamic and cartoony, but it also works like an amplifier for the characters' feelings and thoughts. This total dominance of 2 Belgian companies led to an idea that there has to be room in France for a local source, a high-quality publication that would seriously compete with Tintin and Spirou. Many of the European comic creators were heavily influenced by American comics and pop culture. Uderzo and Goscinny were no exception. Uderzo is well known to be a big Walt Disney fan, and he read Mickey Mouse strips since early childhood. Goscinny was a heavy consumer of American movies, and before he met Uderzo, he lived in New York. There he met Harvey Kurtzman, who would later create Mad magazine. Goscinny and Kurtzman even worked together, and their friendship had a profound influence on Goscinny. That silly, sharp-eyed yet warm and often absurd and surreal humor helped Goscinny to become the most successful writer ever from Europe. But that's not all. The group of friends that Goscinny and Kurtzman hanged out with included a lot of important names from American comics, such as John Severin, Jack Davis, Wally Wood, Will Elder. When Uderzo and Goscinny met in 1951, their friendship was, as Uderzo put it, love at first sight. They had the same favorite film, they had the same favorite comical heroes. Together they looked at the European comic scene and they thought it was too narrow, too stale, too predictable. They wanted to bring in new type of gags and puns and humor that had more layers in it. They wanted to turn the Francophone comics upside down. It was 8 years later when they were sitting at Uderzo's house, sipping pastis and looking for that much-needed idea for a new comic book character. They had already been part of the Belgian comics monopoly, but they wanted more recognition, more rights, more creative freedom. And this meant having your own magazine. In the end, it was 4 friends: Uderzo, Goscinny, Jean-Michel Charlier and Jean Hebrard that took the chance that would kickstart the revolution of French comics made in France. The first issue of Pilote was published in 1959. Goscinny and Uderzo's last-minute idea, Asterix, just made it in time, and it was also displayed on the cover. Pilote and Asterix was an instant success. The first issue sold out all 300,000 copies in one day. Right from the start, Pilote was aiming its content to a slightly older audience than its Belgian competitors. This decision to focus on teenagers also grew the total market of comics. However, despite its sales, the magazine ran into financial problems very quickly, and in 1960 it was bought by Dargaud, a comic book publishing company. Dargaud didn't know how to handle the editorial side of the magazine, and by 1963 things were looking even worse. This difficult situation led Dargaud to ask Goscinny to run the show, and he was put in charge as editor-in-chief. With this new arrangement, Goscinny handling the editorial and writing, all the right pieces fell into place. Pilote turned into a French bande dessinée powerhouse that would define the next decade. While Asterix was always their most successful series, Pilote was also home to many European classics, such as Barbe Rouge, which has been later continued and also available in English through Cinebook under the name of The Redbeard, Tongue et Laverdure, Blueberry, Valerian, Nicapol Trilogy, Philemon, and Lone Sloan. And in 1968, Morris moved his super successful series Lucky Luke from Spirou to Pilote. Pilote also did something that no other competitor had done before. It grew up with its audience, pushing the content all the time to a bit more adult and serious themes. And as the new generation grew up to adulthood reading comics, also how the comics were perceived changed. Before they were just a silly pastime for children. Now they were becoming a normal part of life. But it was always Asterix driving the sales and bringing in money. Pilote issues with Asterix would always sell well. And as to underline this fact, they added the text, the magazine of Asterix and Obelix, to the cover. Goscinny and Uderzo were pounding out story after story with very little or no break at all in between. After any Asterix story arc would come to an end, it was also published in album format. Sales growth was almost exponential. The first book sold 6,000 copies in the year it was published. The year later, the second album sold 20,000 copies. The third album sold 40,000 copies. The fourth one sold 150,000. Again, a year later, the fifth album sold 300,000. In 1966, Asterix and the Big Fight sold 400,000 immediately. And the ninth Asterix volume sold 1.2 million copies in just 2 days. Asterix, Goscinny and Pilote, they didn't just sell a record number of comics. In their wake, the whole France changed their attitude towards the comics. Comics were now loved by adults too. Comics were respected. Comics creators were respected. Original French characters, they were a source of pride. And finally, the word Franco in the term Franco-Belgian comics truly meant something. Pilote magazine's fairy tale ended with a pinch of irony that I think Goscinny would have appreciated if he wasn't looking at it from the ground zero. Years ago, Goscinny and Uderzo had dreamed of turning what they saw as too predictable comic book industry upside down, on its head. They left the Belgian comic book industry that had helped them to grow as creators to set up their own magazine in France that would later transform the whole industry. As the 60s turned 70s, many of the Pilote magazine's artists in a very similar way became unsatisfied with their position in the magazine. And just like Goscinny and Uderzo years ago, they wanted more recognition, more rights, more creative freedom. As the first batch of artists decided to leave and create their own magazine, many were tempted to do the same. This led to the next important step in French comics. In 1974, Jean Moebius Giraud and Philippe Troulet decided that it was their time to go. With two other people, they set up a publishing house, Le Humanoids Associés, that brought up yet another new French comic book magazine to the market. It was called Metal Hurlant, the Screaming Metal. That magazine would soon get its English version published in USA under the name Heavy Metal. And yes, Le Humanoids Associés is the company we today know as Humanoids, with its headquarters in Los Angeles. Pilote tried to keep their reader base happy with even more adult content. However, the artists that were in the magazine to do just that, they were living in batches and setting up their own magazines. The year Moebius left Pilote in 1974, René Goscinny stepped down from his post as editor-in-chief, and the publication pace was changed from weekly to monthly. But it was too late. During this Goscinny era, comics had already established their place in France and the sales were up. But readers and creators alike, they were more interested to skip the magazine part completely and jump direct to albums, which had become the norm in the market. In 1977, the year Heavy Metal was published in USA, France was shocked by the news that René Goscinny had died. He was only 51 years old. Pilote tried to survive the changing times by merging with another comic book magazine, but the inevitable end came in 1989 when Pilote was discontinued. The era of comics magazines was over, but I do have to mention Spirou. Tintin has been discontinued, Pilote has been discontinued, and everything else, but Spirou magazine, 86 years after its first issue was published, it's still running. That is amazing. I think it's the third oldest still running comic book magazine in the world. I was planning to end the video here, but there's an itch in my brain that needs scratching. And it's about Heavy Metal magazine that I mentioned earlier. Heavy Metal arriving in USA sent a tremor through the American comic scene. It shocked, surprised and delighted both readers and creators. Heavy Metal's specialty was its focus on science fiction. That's why it's only appropriate that I contrasted it with the first Star Trek movie. When I saw it as a kid, it blew my mind. Plot of that movie is like an analogy of what Heavy Metal meant to its readers in USA. In the movie, Starship Enterprise and its crew, they meet this mysterious and powerful alien entity, Feature, that is heading for Earth, destroying everything in its path. It only announces that it's coming back to meet its creator. Turns out that Beecher, under its hood, is something very familiar. Just like Beecher, heavy metal's arrival in USA brought back something that in many ways started from USA. Many of the great European comics creators were heavily influenced by US comics. But what had first been a desire in Europe to match their US idols had turned and evolved into something that had never been done before. And just like Beecher, European comics artists had traveled through a vastly different world, becoming themselves an awe-inspiring source of ideas. Decades before, Walt Disney and superheroes had inspired European kids to become comic book artists. Now their work landed back on US soil in the form of Alien and Mysterious magazine. And it blew their minds. I didn't mean to extend this video to heavy metal, but I felt I just had to close the USA Europe USA loop that I started in the first video. I've seen a lot of accusation of European artists stealing from US artists, or the other way around. But that is failing to understand how creativity works. We always create from what came before, and hungry and curious artists will be all the time looking for something new, something that will inspire them. And in the hands and minds of right people, the outcome is not a carbon copy, but it will be something new and exciting, which will be again found by those who come after. This was, for many reasons, the hardest video I've made so far. So if you're still watching, I am very grateful. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.